Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into a world of shadows, where names were false, loyalties blurred, and a single whisper could mean death. It's a story buried beneath the headlines of World War II, erased by Pearl Harbor and forgotten by time. But for a few terrifying years, it was the most dangerous spy operation ever uncovered on American soil. This is the story of the Duquesne Spy Ring, a Nazi network of saboteurs, traitors, and couriers hiding in plain sight across the United States. They watched our coastlines, they mapped our factories, they sent Hitler the secrets of a nation unprepared for war, and they almost got away with it. At the center was a man no one saw coming. William Sebold, a German-born American citizen, blackmailed into service by the Gestapo, and then turned double agent for the FBI. For 2 years he lived a double life, wiretapped, followed, shadowed by men who would kill him if they knew. His betrayal brought down 33 Nazi agents and sealed his fate forever. Before we drop into this, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, only if you're into true stories that grip like a thriller and chill like a ghost story. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing the night owls and early risers who tune in. Now shut the door. Let the dark come in. We're going back to 1936, to the rainy docks of Hamburg, where a man stepped off a ship into the jaws of Hitler's spy machine and into a game of deception he could never escape. It began not with a gunshot or a fiery speech, but with a whisper. A man stepped into the FBI office in Manhattan, rain clinging to his overcoat, tension crawling beneath his skin. His name was William Sebold, a mechanic by trade, born in Germany but sworn to the United States. He looked like any other immigrant trying to build a quiet life in a stormy world. But the words he spoke that morning detonated silently within the walls of the bureau. "I've been recruited by the Nazis, and I want out." He didn't flinch when he said it, but his voice carried the weight of something far larger than personal fear. Behind that single sentence was a web of promises, threats, and betrayals stretching across continents. He wasn't just a man asking for protection. He was the key to exposing the largest Nazi spy ring ever uncovered on American soil. But before William Sebold found himself caught in the gears of global espionage, before the FBI transformed him into the heart of a counterintelligence operation that would shake the foundations of American security, before 33 Nazi spies were arrested in a single night in 1941. There was the Quiet War. A war not fought with tanks or bombers, but with briefcases, fake names, whispers over radio frequencies, and eyes watching through cafe windows. The story begins years earlier, in the smoldering wake of a defeated Germany, at a time when the world thought it had already learned its lesson. The First World War had promised to end all wars. It had claimed millions, redrawn borders, and buried the old order under blood and ash. But peace was short-lived, and from the ruins of Versailles emerged a hunger that no treaty could suppress. In the early 1930s, Germany was fractured, economically broken, politically unstable, and ripe for radicalism. Into this cauldron stepped Adolf Hitler, a former corporal with a messianic vision and a ferocious belief in national rebirth through struggle. His rise wasn't just political, it was mythic, orchestrated, calculated, and fed by the desperation of a nation that had been humiliated on the world stage. By 1933, Hitler was chancellor. Within months, he was Führer. And within his shadow, a new kind of war began to brew, one that required no formal declaration and operated best in silence. The Nazi state was more than a political regime. It was an ideological machine. Every institution was bent toward its goals of expansion, domination, and ideological purification. The military grew. Propaganda became gospel. And deep within the dark arteries of the German state, a quieter force evolved to meet the demands of Hitler's vision: the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence agency. Led by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, a cunning and often contradictory figure, the Abwehr was tasked with conducting foreign intelligence, espionage, sabotage, and counterintelligence for the Nazi war effort. But Canaris was no ordinary Nazi loyalist. A career naval officer and an old-school conservative, he viewed Hitler with suspicion and would later play a shadowy role in plots against him. Yet, in these early years, he gave the Abwehr its teeth, sharpening its reach across Europe, and soon far beyond. To the world, Germany was still a recovering nation. But inside Berlin's Spartan intelligence offices, typewriters clattered late into the night, mapping the vulnerabilities of foreign powers. The United States, despite its distance and apparent indifference to Europe's roiling tensions, was placed squarely in the crosshairs. Why America? It wasn't just military blueprints or troop locations. Germany needed America's industrial secrets, its factories, steel plants, aircraft designs, and especially the research being done in military and radio technologies. If war came, and for Hitler it was never a question of if, but when, Germany needed to know how to strike before the US could mobilize its massive potential. And to do that, they needed eyes and ears inside the American heartland. They also needed to understand the rhythms of the Atlantic, shipping schedules, naval logistics, and supply chain vulnerabilities. The US Navy's movements, oil exports, and shipbuilding data were of critical interest to Berlin, even as America remained officially neutral in the unfolding conflicts in Europe. German agents were already studying how to sink American freighters if needed, how to sabotage naval yards, and how to disable key infrastructure if the time came. The Nazi plan for America wasn't to invade with troops, it was to invade with information. And for that, they needed people willing to disappear into the crowd. Meanwhile, America slept. The United States of the early 1930s was more concerned with surviving the Great Depression than watching the winds in Europe. Political energy was focused inward. Franklin D. Roosevelt had just begun the massive undertaking of stabilizing a shattered economy. Isolationism, both in politics and in public opinion, was the prevailing mood. The scars of World War I were still visible, and few Americans had any desire to become entangled in another European conflict. The intelligence landscape reflected this complacency. The FBI, at that time, was still finding its identity. Though J. Edgar Hoover had already been appointed director and had begun his campaign to transform the Bureau into a modern force, its expertise was in chasing bank robbers, kidnappers, and gangsters. Espionage, counterintelligence, foreign threats, these were not yet in its DNA. There was no CIA. Military intelligence was fragmented, siloed, and often outdated. The U.S. government had no cohesive strategy to detect or neutralize foreign spies operating on American soil. Those who suspected that such spies even existed were often dismissed as alarmists or conspiracy theorists. Most Americans simply didn't believe that foreign agents could be walking their streets, dining in their restaurants, teaching in their universities, or working alongside them on factory floors. But they were. Germany didn't send its top military officers or obvious ideologues to infiltrate the United States. It sent engineers, students, shipping clerks, business travelers, naturalized citizens, and even former professors. Some were true believers in the Nazi cause, others were simply opportunists. A few were coerced, trapped between old allegiances and new identities, and some, like William Sebold, would make a fateful choice that would alter the course of history. Before Sebold would play his part, however, the foundations of a vast spy network were being quietly laid across the American landscape. German consulates served as cover for covert meetings. Nazi sympathizer groups like the German-American Bund hosted rallies and distributed propaganda, providing fertile ground for recruitment. Universities became hot spots for foreign students reporting back to Berlin. Even major U.S. corporations, unknowingly or willfully blind, became unwitting contributors to the Nazi war machine. Their internal developments leaked through employees who were being paid in secrets and promises. By 1936, the Abwehr's attention turned sharply toward building a more structured, more coordinated espionage ring within the United States. They needed someone who could unite disparate assets, manage communications, and bring legitimacy to the mission. that someone was already living under multiple aliases, with a past so twisted that even his enemies admired its genius. His name was Fritz Duquesne. Duquesne was not just a spy, he was a shapeshifter, a man with a past so dramatic it read like fiction, yet each page was frighteningly real. Born in South Africa, he had fought against the British in the Boer War, survived a prison camp, escaped capture multiple times, and claimed to have sunk British ships during World War I. He had once posed as a journalist, then as an inventor, then as a war hero. Every identity was a costume, every conversation a performance. By the mid-1930s, he was living in New York, giving lectures, writing columns, and networking in intellectual circles. Behind the scenes, he was already in contact with the Abwehr, offering his skills and experience as an espionage organizer. He spoke English like a native, understood American culture, and had no shortage of stories to win over potential recruits. He was a veteran manipulator, and the Abwehr trusted him to deliver. And deliver he did. The network he helped build would span the eastern seaboard and stretch into key industrial and military facilities. Recruits would pass on naval charts, aircraft blueprints, oil shipment data, and even experimental weapons information. Coded messages would be sent through clandestine shortwave stations. Some spies used invisible ink, others hid microdots inside postage stamps. Information moved in silence, carried in suitcases, whispered in hotel rooms, mailed across oceans, in letters that looked like grocery lists. And still, America slept. Inside the FBI, pressure began to build. Reports from foreign allies, particularly the British, warned of increasing Nazi infiltration efforts. Domestic tips, some credible, others not, began trickling in. Hoover, always aware of his public image, began to take notice. But the Bureau's limitations were severe. Surveillance techniques were rudimentary. Foreign language fluency among agents was scarce. And there was no central database of suspected foreign operatives. The enemy, if it existed, was ghost-like, present, dangerous, and largely invisible. But that was about to change. The seeds of America's awakening to the reality of Nazi espionage were being planted. The Abwehr's confidence was growing. Their agents operated with impunity. And in the shadows of this rising storm, one man, William Sebold, would soon become the linchpin in the quiet war that was no longer so quiet. Because the battlefield wasn't in Europe yet. It was inside filing cabinets, telephone wires, factory blueprints, and harbor manifests. It was in the hands of engineers, machinists, and radio operators who had no idea the man next to them was selling secrets to Berlin. It was already right here. He called himself a patriot. Others would call him a traitor. But long before he whispered secrets into the ears of Nazi handlers or sketched out targets on the New York harbor, Fritz Duquesne was already fluent in the art of becoming someone else. His life read not like a resume, but like a dossier compiled by a dozen competing intelligence agencies, none of which could fully agree on which parts were truth and which were deception. And that was exactly how he wanted it. In the years before William Sebold walked into that FBI office, before the Duquesne Spy Ring became a headline buried beneath the thunder of Pearl Harbor, the man who would lend his name to that infamous operation was already spinning an intricate web. He was, by 1936, not merely a recruiter or a handler. He was the mythic center of something darker, a creature of war, lies, survival, and vengeance. The war that shaped him came not in the 1940s, but in the embers of the 19th century, on the arid plains of South Africa, where the British Empire clashed with the Boer republics in a brutal, mechanized campaign for control. Duquesne was born in East London, in the Cape Colony, to a French Huguenot family that had fled religious persecution generations earlier. He grew up in a world of contradictions, European aristocratic tradition woven into the frontier violence of colonial Africa. The British, to him, were not rulers. They were oppressors. That belief would harden into hatred as he aged, and it would haunt every decision he made for the rest of his life. When the Second Boer War erupted in 1899, Duquesne fought not only with ferocity, but with theatrical flair. He was daring, reckless, and unyielding. His unit specialized in sabotage, derailing trains, destroying British supply lines, and slipping behind enemy lines in the dead of night. But when his command was captured, Duquesne found himself a prisoner of the empire he loathed. In a move that would foreshadow his lifelong penchant for illusion, he faked paralysis to get transferred to a hospital and escaped under the cover of night. The escape became legend. Some claimed he swam across a crocodile-infested river. Others said he bribed his guards. Duquesne never corrected the tales. He only embellished them. He made his way to Europe and then to the United States, shedding his identity like a used passport. In London, he claimed to be a war correspondent. In New York, he introduced himself as Major Frederick Duquesne, a Boer military attaché. He gave lectures, wrote fiery editorials against British imperialism, and mingled with journalists and intellectuals. He cultivated an air of mystery and credibility, never too specific, never too verifiable. He posed for photographs in military regalia, sometimes with medals no one could place. Every city he entered, he reinvented himself. The man was not merely hiding, he was performing. During World War I, Duquesne offered his services to the Germans. If his hatred of Britain had once been ideological, it now had a body count. According to post-war investigations, Duquesne was involved in sabotage operations on American soil on behalf of the German Empire. He was accused of transmitting information that led to the sinking of British ships by German U-boats. The most infamous allegation was his role in the destruction of the HMS Hampshire, a British cruiser that exploded off the coast of Scotland in 1916. Among the dead was Field Marshal Lord Kitchener, Britain's Secretary of State for War. Duquesne, years later, would claim responsibility for orchestrating Kitchener's death. Whether he was truly behind it or simply exploiting tragedy for legend was never definitively proven, but what mattered was that he convinced people he could. The line between fact and fiction blurred so completely that even the intelligence agencies hunting him could never agree on which version of Duquesne they were chasing. Eventually, the U.S. government caught up with him. In 1917, Duquesne was arrested on charges of espionage and sabotage. He was tried, convicted, and imprisoned, but not for long. Citing health issues, he was moved from one facility to another until, in 1919, he simply vanished. Some reports suggested he escaped from a sanitarium in Pennsylvania by sawing through a window. Others believed he bribed his way out. Again, Duquesne remained silent. His silence, as always, allowed the myth to swell. He disappeared for several years. There were whispers he had been seen in Mexico, in South America, even in Cuba, teaching survival tactics to revolutionaries. Then, like a ghost stepping out of the fog, he re-emerged in the 1930s in New York City. Older, more refined, but no less dangerous. By then, Hitler had risen to power, and Germany's intelligence services were expanding their reach with renewed urgency. The Abwehr, under Admiral Canaris, was tasked with penetrating not just enemy governments, but the industrial and scientific infrastructure that would fuel their militaries. They didn't need saboteurs with bombs. They needed minds that could walk unnoticed into factories, extract secrets, and leave nothing behind. And in Duquesne, they saw something rare. A man who could not only disappear, but also convince others to follow him into the shadows. His Nazi handlers didn't recruit him in a dramatic midnight rendezvous or from a dusty file labeled asset potential. They came to him precisely because he was already in motion. He had kept his contacts in Europe. He still burned with anti-British fervor. He was fluent in lies, loyal to no nation, and utterly comfortable inhabiting false identities. He had the perfect psychological profile of a deep-cover organizer, not a field agent, but a maestro. Duquesne didn't just join the Abwehr, he sold them a plan. His pitch was simple. The United States, distracted by its economic woes and its desire to stay out of European conflict, was ripe for infiltration. Duquesne knew where the cracks were. He offered to build a spy ring from scratch. Not just thieves or thugs, but engineers, radio operators, technicians, and industry insiders who could pass unnoticed through shipyards and factories. He promised not just information, but structure: coordinated cells, redundant communications, escape plans, safe houses, coded messaging systems, and they said yes. Between 1936 and 1939, Duquesne transformed himself once again. Now he was a journalist, a correspondent, a world-traveling lecturer on African politics and naval history. He gave interviews, wrote articles, attended social functions. Behind this mask, he quietly assembled a network of operatives. Some he recruited personally, others were handed to him by the Abwehr. His charisma was magnetic. He knew how to make his recruits feel important, part of a secret mission that would change the course of history. His hatred of the British remained the driving force, but Duquesne didn't need to convince his recruits to hate Britain. He only needed to convince them that America's neutrality was a facade, that by helping Germany they were preserving peace, or at the very least serving a greater good. For others, it wasn't ideology that pulled them in. It was money, or blackmail, or the promise of adventure. Each operative had a different story. Duquesne wove them all into the same tapestry. Some were trained in espionage techniques abroad and sent back to the United States with fake identities and new missions. Others were born in America, but sympathetic to the Nazi cause. Some were simply told to gather ship manifests or ask seemingly innocent questions at their jobs. Most of them didn't know each other. Duquesne operated in layers, segmenting his network to protect its core. At the heart of it all was Duquesne's genius for illusion. He operated from a series of safe locations: hotel rooms, rented offices, even post boxes. He used codes hidden in innocuous letters. He maintained contact with the Abwehr via intermediaries, but he always remained elusive, never staying in one location for long, never putting too much trust in any single person. And yet, for all his discipline, Duquesne couldn't resist the grandeur of his own legend. He talked, sometimes too much. To those he trusted, he shared stories of his daring escapes, of his role in sabotaging the British war effort, of the time he was nearly executed in Africa, but cheated death. Some believed him. Others didn't care whether the stories were true. What mattered was that Duquesne made them feel like they were part of something thrilling, dangerous, and important. But beneath the performance, Duquesne was not a man of steady convictions. He was a survivor. He had no loyalty to Hitler, nor to any government. He saw espionage as a game, a stage on which he could be both hero and villain. He resented institutions, mocked rules, and manipulated everyone, even his own handlers. His ability to deceive had become so refined that it was indistinguishable from belief. He convinced himself he was still fighting the same war, the one against the British Empire that had scarred his childhood. Everything else, even the Nazi ideology he claimed to support, was secondary. And yet, this very arrogance would lay the first stone of his downfall. As Duquesne expanded his ring and drew in more operatives, he exposed himself to risk. More people meant more vulnerabilities. More communication meant more chances for interception. The tighter the net he wove, the harder it became to remain invisible. The FBI, though still underprepared and understaffed in the world of counterintelligence, had begun to awaken to the reality that something was happening beneath the surface of American life. There were whispers of foreign nationals sending coded messages, a few suspicious fires in naval yards, letters intercepted with odd phrasing, reports of individuals taking photographs of restricted areas. None of it formed a complete picture, but Hoover, ever obsessed with the Bureau's public image, began reallocating resources to monitor the German-American Bund and to investigate the possibility that foreign agents were already embedded within American industries. What they didn't know, what they couldn't yet imagine, was that the man orchestrating it all was living comfortably in New York, sipping coffee in Upper Manhattan, laughing with newspaper editors, and sending sabotage blueprints across the Atlantic disguised as love letters. Duquesne had done it. He had built a spy ring from scratch, operating in the heart of America, undetected and ambitious. But he would make one fatal miscalculation. He would trust a man named William Sebold, and in doing so, the architect of America's greatest foreign spy ring would set the stage for his own ruin. because even a phantom can leave footprints, and even the most perfect lie begins to unravel when the storyteller forgets who's listening. He once said, "A good lie is like a fine wine. It needs to breathe, travel, and linger." By the time 1937 arrived, Fritz Duquesne had mastered the vintage. He had aged his false identities, corked his British hatred into plausible motives, and bottled his venomous charm into something intoxicating, something that made people lean in, nod in admiration, and then, unknowingly, hand over the keys to national security. But if the man himself was the bait, the real danger was the web he began to spin. And this time, it wasn't just for show, it was war. Just a quiet one, fought in whispers, ink, and static. In the months that followed his formal recruitment by the Abwehr, Duquesne set to work like a man possessed. He had the backing of Berlin, a Phantom's record, and the perfect backdrop, a distracted America, adrift in its own problems. Roosevelt's New Deal was still digging the country out of the Depression. Newspapers were focused on labor strikes, dust storms, and breadlines. Hitler had not yet become the monster in American headlines. Europe's turbulence was still, to many, a foreign problem. That blindness was Duquesne's canvas, and he painted with people. It started in Philadelphia, not in a shadowed alley or underground bar, but in a public lecture hall. Duquesne, presenting himself as a war correspondent and African hunter, delivered a talk on British colonial atrocities to a crowd of curious intellectuals and isolationist sympathizers. Between slides of jungle expeditions and stories of being captured and tortured by the British, he dropped casual references to German efficiency and the rising truth of the Reich. It was soft, wrapped in anecdote, but persuasive. Afterward, a young engineer from a shipbuilding firm lingered, introduced himself, and admitted how disgusted he was with British imperialism. That engineer became his first recruit. From that moment on, Duquesne stopped pretending this was about ideology. He realized something deeper. People didn't need to believe in Nazism. They only needed to hate something else more. Britain, capitalism, Roosevelt, their bosses, their taxes, the war that hadn't even started yet. His genius wasn't in converting Americans into fascists. It was in making them feel like traitors to the right cause. By the end of that year, Duquesne had pulled in nearly a dozen individuals, all carefully chosen, not just for access, but for invisibility. There was Carl Schaefer, a radio technician in Los Angeles, who had already been quietly collecting naval radio frequencies for a side project. Now, he'd simply pass that side project to a small shortwave radio, retooled and smuggled out through Panama. There was Anita Rex, a socialite and former Broadway chorus girl turned travel agent, who used her proximity to wealthy clients and State Department officials to eavesdrop and, in some cases, photograph sensitive documents left unattended on hotel room desks. And there was Dr. Hermann Wenzel, an elderly German-born chemist in Chicago who had no intention of serving the Nazis, but whose hatred for what he called British scientific theft dated back to a patent dispute in 1910. Duquesne offered him a way to get even. Each of these people operated independently. That was the brilliance and the curse of the Duquesne Ring. There was no grand headquarters, no secret lair, just a series of small, strange, almost accidental alliances that spread like a fungus in damp corners of American society. You could have walked by 5 members of the Ring in a single day: an electrician fixing a city transformer, a clerk in the customs office, a retired colonel playing chess in the park, and never known the country's secrets had already passed through their hands. The courier routes were perhaps the most elegant part of the system. Rather than risk direct cable transmissions to Berlin, which could be intercepted or triangulated, Duquesne's contacts funneled information through Latin America, especially Brazil, Argentina, and Cuba. These countries, already hubs of German influence, acted as relay stations. A report on U.S. naval movements in San Diego would be mailed, disguised as a medical journal or academic correspondence, to a nondescript P.O. box in Sao Paulo. From there, a trusted contact, usually a German-born businessman or diplomat, would hand-deliver the microfilmed content to an Abwehr agent returning to Hamburg. The FBI didn't have agents in South America. The Nazis did. In a hotel room in Manhattan, invisible ink became an art form. Duquesne taught his recruits how to use lemon juice, starch-based solutions, and even urine to write hidden messages between lines of ordinary letters. In one famous example, a 4-page love letter written in passionate prose to a fictional fiancé in Cincinnati was, in truth, a technical analysis of a new aircraft engine being tested in New Jersey. It described thrust ratios, fuel capacity, and engine plate materials, all wrapped in metaphors of longing and heat. Only under a heated iron would the real meaning emerge, and even then, only if you knew where to look. By 1938, the ring had quietly expanded to over 20 operatives, some knowingly complicit, others useful dupes. Duquesne didn't always tell them the whole truth. A young woman working at a shipping company believed she was helping a German-American historical archive. A dock worker thought he was passing union schedules to a journalist investigating wage theft. Very few knew they were aiding Nazi military operations. That plausible deniability was not an accident, it was designed. Meanwhile, the FBI was asleep. At least mostly. Their budget had been slashed after Prohibition's repeal. Their attention was still consumed by internal threats: anarchists, communists, gangsters. Hoover's bureau was good at tapping phones, infiltrating labor strikes, and keeping tabs on Hollywood. But it had no counterintelligence division. It didn't even have a working relationship with the Army or Navy on espionage threats. J. Edgar Hoover himself was ambivalent. He didn't like foreigners, that was true, but foreign espionage wasn't glamorous. It didn't make headlines like the takedown of John Dillinger or the pursuit of Babyface Nelson. That began to change in early 1938 when MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service, sent a quiet delegation to Washington. They had intercepted German transmissions mentioning US-based assets with access to British shipping patterns. One of the names mentioned was Duquesne, a bastardization of Duquesne's name. The British warned the Americans something bigger was underway. German espionage was no longer just about sabotage. It was about prepositioning for a global war, and America, whether it admitted it or not, was on the board. The message reached Hoover's desk, but his first response was skepticism. After all, this was coming from the same British intelligence community that had staged leaks and forgeries during World War I to drag the U.S. into battle. Could they be doing it again? A campaign to push Roosevelt into war against Germany. Hoover ordered his agents to investigate, but with caution. He didn't want to be used, and more importantly, he didn't want to look gullible. Still, the British had lit a match. Within weeks, internal memos circulated inside the Bureau recommending the creation of a Special Intelligence Service, which would later become the FBI's first official Foreign Counterintelligence Unit. The idea was tentative, underfunded and underpopulated, but it was a start, and it came not a moment too soon. In New York, Duquesne had just recruited one of his most dangerous operatives yet, William G. Sebold. But we're not there yet, because before Sebold walked into the FBI's office and offered to become a double agent, before the courtroom collapsed under the weight of 19 simultaneous espionage indictments, before Duquesne stared at a judge and lied with such conviction, it made the court clerk flinch. Before all of that, the ring had to be built. And build it he did. Lisbon, 1938. In a cramped apartment overlooking a busy street, a German agent named Franz Appler was preparing 2 American citizens for their return flight. One was an aviation mechanic from St. Louis. The other, a Puerto Rican-American man with family ties to Havana. Both had been brought to Portugal under the guise of a business consulting venture. In truth, they had been trained in cipher codes, dead-drop techniques, and wireless communication using shortwave radio. Their passports were real. Their jobs, semi-legitimate, but their real role was now clear: send intelligence home. Back in New York, an office clerk in a German export company began asking unusual questions. Not loudly, just casually, over lunch. How many crates were leaving the harbor? Did anyone know where the next shipment of steel was headed? She claimed it was for an inventory report. No one questioned it. That information, collated with ship logs and customs reports, was passed along via typed reports disguised as invoices for typewriter repairs. One such report, intercepted much later, revealed the shipping schedule of the USS Texas, along with notes about which docks had low visible patrol. By the end of 1939, the Duquesne Ring had grown to over 30 operatives embedded in more than a dozen American cities: Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Miami, Boston. Their targets were vast: naval yards, aircraft factories, chemical labs, oil refineries. But so were their methods. One agent used birdwatching clubs as a cover to survey coastal defenses. Another posed as a traveling salesman to map airfields. A third operated a ham radio network out of his attic, pretending to offer technical advice to local operators while piggybacking coded pulses into foreign frequencies. And still, the FBI did not see it. Or rather, they saw pieces, but not the pattern. It would take a man walking into their office, sweating, pale, and clutching a secret that would unravel it all, a man named Sebold, to make them see. But until then, Duquesne's lie breathed, traveled, and lingered, like a fine wine, a poisoned one, waiting to be uncorked. It began, as turning points so often do, not with a bang but with an interruption. An unfinished memo from a junior FBI agent in the New York field office, scribbled in haste, half dismissed, then quietly retrieved from the wastebasket by someone who couldn't shake the feeling that something about it mattered. The memo had flagged an unusual pattern of travel among a few German nationals registered at Manhattan hotels. No one had broken the law, technically, but the clustering of names, the short burst stays, the way they checked in under one name and checked out under another, it lingered. Someone in that office, a man who didn't wear his badge like a brooch but rather like a bruise that never healed, decided to keep watching. It was late 1939, and the New York bureau office was a maze of conflict. The hallways echoed with the stiff certainty of traditional lawmen who had spent the last decade chasing bank robbers and bootleggers. They weren't interested in invisible crimes. They didn't trust men who spoke in code or stared too long at maps. And above all, they didn't like to be told what they didn't know. These were men of muscle and warrants. The words espionage and counterintelligence still tasted foreign in their mouths. But a younger breed of agent had begun to emerge, quietly and awkwardly, often relegated to desks in windowless rooms. They were analysts, linguists, cryptographers, men with dusty spectacles and strange habits who drank too much coffee and asked too many questions. Some of them were veterans of European universities. Others were homegrown puzzle solvers who had read too much about Sherlock Holmes as children. These men, with their wires and ink and instincts, were the earliest antibodies in a bureau that didn't yet realize it was infected. Above them, in Washington, J. Edgar Hoover sat in a paradox of his own making. He demanded absolute loyalty, immaculately typed reports, and headlines that praised the bureau without inviting too many questions. But he was also terrified of embarrassment. Failure, to Hoover, was not just dangerous, it was personal. The idea that foreign spies might be operating on American soil without his knowledge was unthinkable. The idea that some of his own agents were not taking the threat seriously enough was worse. Hoover authorized a quiet reshuffling. He didn't announce it. He simply issued internal memos hinting at a new prioritization of foreign subversion threats. He appointed Special Agent Don Whitehead to coordinate intelligence from the New York office and tasked another ambitious officer, Raymond Newkirk, to oversee German infiltration. The orders were vague on purpose. Hoover liked deniability, but the message had been sent. It caused ripple effects inside the New York office, none of them tidy. Senior agents scoffed. They said, "We don't spy on citizens." Others, more privately, muttered that any investigation into German clubs or immigrant societies could look like racial profiling. America wasn't at war yet. The neutrality laws still held. Embassies still shook hands with smiles and sipped cocktails at midtown banquets. The German-American Bund, meanwhile, held public parades that looked like community picnics to the casual observer, unless you looked closely at the armbands, Behind the scenes, however, cracks had formed. There was pressure from Roosevelt's inner circle, from MI6 liaisons who whispered of German wireless stations in Lisbon, from a few tenacious agents who had started following patterns. Hoover did not like being pressured, but he liked being blindsided even less. A bureau subunit was created in October 1939. Its name was deliberately dull, the Foreign Influence Desk, but its mandate was not. The desk was told to compile all leads, tips, anomalies, and fragments that might point to Nazi infiltration. They worked out of a third-floor wing in the Justice Department building, using borrowed desks and filing cabinets scavenged from the mail fraud division. That same month, a German national named Gunther Gustafsson was detained at Ellis Island. It was supposed to be routine, a paperwork discrepancy. But in his luggage, customs officers found a sheaf of torn technical drawings, unlabeled, unsigned, but clearly blueprints. One depicted a submarine ballast system. Gustafsson said he had found them in the trash of a shipyard he toured in Norfolk. He said he liked machines. He said it with a shrug. The agents weren't sure whether to laugh or file charges. Instead, they contacted the Foreign Influence Desk. Within 72 hours, Gustafsson had disappeared from official records. He would later reappear in a secret holding unit in upstate New York, identified as a potential asset if flipped, or a quiet deportation case if not. In Brooklyn, a new file was opened under the name of Heinrich Clausing, a German-American chemist who worked on synthetic rubbers at a lab contracted by the War Department. Clausing's name had come up during a wiretap of a completely unrelated case, a bookie operation tied to a known associate of the German-American Bund. The mention was brief, almost dismissive. "Hank says the rubber formula is finally ready. We're sending it next week." The memo crossed desks like a contagion. An analyst named Meredith Klein flagged it. She had no field clearance, no weapon, and no desk phone. But she understood materials chemistry. She knew that formulae for synthetic rubber had massive implications for military logistics. Her superiors told her to file it under non-actionable because Clausing had no criminal record. She didn't. Instead, she walked the memo upstairs to Newkirk himself. 3 days later, Clausing was under passive surveillance. 7 days after that, a dead drop was found in Prospect Park containing half a page of algebraic notation and a coded phrase: "The garden sleeps, but the soil is warm." Meanwhile, Duquesne's operations grew more daring. His agents were no longer just intercepting blueprints. They were building dossiers on key U.S. military personnel, tracing their travel, family habits, and potential vulnerabilities. Some of this information was being sent back through neutral ports. Other bits were compiled in hidden safes in rented rooms, disguised as travel agency records or commercial invoices. And still, inside the FBI, not everyone agreed on what to do. Whitehead argued for aggressive moves, wiretaps, tailing suspects, even breaking into apartments under the pretext of safety inspections. Others warned that such tactics could unravel diplomatic ties. One senior agent wrote in a memo, "We do not want to become a secret police." But the line between domestic law enforcement and foreign espionage was blurring. Every day, the Bureau found itself sliding further into a realm it had never trained for. The real shift came in March 1940, when a message intercepted in Buenos Aires was handed off by British intelligence to FBI liaisons. The message was short. It referenced an American source using the code name Artist, reporting on airborne radials and port calibrations. The British decoded the message, then quietly handed it to their American counterparts with a single, chilling sentence: "You have a breach." Within days, FBI agents began mapping the communication flow of every radio technician, lab assistant, and logistics officer who had recently traveled between New York and Latin America. The list grew, and at the top of several overlapping names was one man, William Sebold. No one knew it yet, but the noose had begun to tighten. And inside the Bureau, behind the turf wars and personnel files and cautious memos, a silent agreement was forming. They would no longer wait for sabotage. They would hunt the saboteurs first. They just didn't know how close they already were. He didn't look like a man who was about to change the course of American history. He looked ordinary. Work-worn hands, a furrowed brow, the kind of gaze trained on factory machines and not spy satellites. In another life, William Sebold might have retired a machinist in Newark, safe, invisible, anonymous. But in March 1940, as he sat in a stuffy consulate office in Hamburg, trying not to shake under the pressure of the two Nazi officers staring across from him, it was clear his anonymity was over. What began as a trip to renew his German passport had unraveled into a quiet nightmare. He was told, without ceremony or pity, that he would return to America as a traitor. They told him it wasn't optional. They had his file, his background, details about his family, especially the ones still in Germany. Refusal, one of the officers hinted, wouldn't just mean trouble for Sebold. It would mean trouble for people he loved. One of the men handed him a paper. It was bland, bureaucratic, but on it, in clean black ink, was his new identity, Harry Sawyer. That would be the name he would use to receive instructions from Berlin, transmit coded messages, and organize sabotage operations across the United States. He would be the latest asset in Hitler's vast network of foreign agents. His first task? Return to New York and report to a man named Fritz Duquesne. Sebold didn't sleep much after that. He paced his hotel room in Hamburg, turning the name over in his mind like a prayer and a curse. Duquesne. He'd never heard of him before, not directly, but the man's reputation, his theatrical flair, his obsession with Britain. It clung to stories, to whispers, and now Sebold was being asked to serve him. What the Abwehr didn't know, what changed everything, was that William Sebold had made a quiet detour on the way back. Before sailing for America, he stepped into the U.S. consulate in Cologne and asked to speak to someone from American intelligence. What followed was a meeting that few in the room would ever talk about again, but that would become the cornerstone of one of the most consequential counterintelligence operations in U.S. history. Sebold laid everything out, the threats, the documents, the orders. He didn't want to be a Nazi spy. He was willing to help, but only under one condition. I want to work for America. By the time Sebold arrived in New York that spring, the wheels inside the FBI were already turning. J. Edgar Hoover had read the reports. The Bureau's New York field office, now under tremendous pressure after months of bureaucratic inertia and turf disputes, saw in Sebold a miracle, a man who could walk into the lion's den without suspicion. And so began a plan so audacious, so fragile in its complexity, that even those closest to it feared it would collapse under the weight of a single mistake. They would build a fake spy operation, a shell that looked and sounded like a German outpost, but was entirely controlled by the FBI. At its center would be Sebold, pretending to serve Hitler, while feeding every name, location, and secret back to Washington. The first problem was technical. Sebold would need a shortwave radio set, forged correspondence, secret inks, and invisible codes that mimicked authentic German operations. The Bureau brought in their best cryptographers, signal technicians, and surveillance specialists. They rented a tiny office on Times Square, presenting it as the American headquarters of Harry Sawyer, consultant to the Reich. To anyone walking by, it looked like a one-man operation, but behind the walls, microphones were hidden in lamps, cameras embedded in ventilation shafts. Every word spoken within that office would be recorded, every meeting logged. The trap was set. But the psychological toll on Sebold was immediate and severe. From the moment he landed, he had to live a double life with no room for error. He wrote letters to his wife that revealed nothing. He sat alone in the spy center, waiting for instructions, unsure when or how Duquesne would make contact. His every movement had to appear authentic. At night, when he returned to his cover lodging in the Bronx, he sometimes sat up for hours, watching the shadows on the wall, waiting for the knock that would mean someone had seen through it all. There would be no backup in the field. If something went wrong, if a meeting turned dangerous or a tail noticed him, he would be alone. Then, one day in May, the message came through. It was a cipher, seemingly routine, but the signature was unmistakable. It was from Fritz Duquesne. They arranged to meet, and the location was deliberately mundane. A diner near 125th Street, busy enough to blend in. Duquesne arrived late. He always did. He carried himself like a man who assumed the world was waiting for him anyway. He was older now, heavier than the photographs the Bureau had from his Boer War days, but his eyes, those cold, amused eyes, were the same. He smiled as if meeting an old friend, and when Sebold gave his rehearsed answers, Duquesne leaned in close and whispered, "Welcome to the real war." What followed was a study in paranoia. Duquesne insisted on using code names. He refused to write anything down. At one point, he made Sebold switch tables 3 times before speaking, but gradually he opened up. He spoke of targets, factories, naval yards. He wanted access to blueprints for new aircraft designs, details on shipping schedules, radar development, and submarine movement. The scope of what he asked for made even the seasoned FBI analysts nervous. It was clear. Duquesne wasn't just another spy. He was a conductor of espionage, orchestrating a sprawling network with almost theatrical flair. His ego thrived on control, secrecy, and manipulation. Sebold, despite his inner unease, played the part perfectly. Each meeting was more valuable than the last. Over the next few weeks, more agents arrived. One by one, Duquesne's associates came to see Harry Sawyer. They thought they were entering a safe house of the Reich. In truth, they were walking into the most elaborate trap the FBI had ever conceived. There was Max Haupt, father of Herbert Haupt, a young saboteur who would later be executed by the U.S. government. There was Erwin Siegler, a former German naval officer turned shipping agent. There were engineers, couriers, even socialites with access to whispered conversations in high-end salons. Some came to pass along packages, others came just to talk. Every meeting was recorded, every word cataloged. But with every meeting, Sebold grew more anxious. Some of the visitors were cautious, suspicious. A few tested him, asking technical questions about radio equipment, signal delays, drop locations. One day, a courier named Lothar Witzke came in and stared for a long time at the walls, then the lamp. Sebold froze. Did he notice the wire? But Witzke said nothing. He simply handed over an envelope and left. The team monitoring the office held their breath for hours afterward, waiting to see if word would spread that something was wrong. It never did. Outside the office, FBI agents shadowed every suspect Sebold named. They trailed them to waterfront warehouses, steamship offices, military installations. They watched as blueprints were photographed, as microdots were concealed in cigarette filters and envelope glue. They began to see just how vast Duquesne's network had become and how close it had come to going undetected. One agent would later recall, "They were everywhere, and until Sebold, we didn't even know they were breathing the same air." Sebold's mental state, however, began to fray. His handler at the FBI, Agent Edward G. Appel, met with him regularly in secret, offering encouragement, reassurances, sometimes just letting him talk. Sebold confessed he couldn't sleep. He feared one slip of the tongue, one wrongly folded letter, one missed code phrase would unravel everything. "I feel like I'm in a play," he said once, "but if I forget a single line, the curtain falls, and I don't get to leave." And still the operation continued. Every day, more intelligence came in. Every day, Sebold met another piece of the ring. The Bureau was building a case, not just to arrest, but to crush the network publicly, to send a message to Berlin and to every other hidden agent on American soil. But they needed time. They needed more evidence. And they needed Duquesne to keep believing. Which is why, in late summer of 1940, when Sebold received a message from Berlin asking him to begin transmitting coded reports via shortwave, the FBI made its boldest move yet. They built an actual shortwave station in Long Island, rigged with wires, surveillance, and tightly controlled access, and let Sebold transmit. The reports he sent were written by the FBI. They contained enough truth to keep the Abwehr interested, but not enough to compromise national security. and every response from Berlin was intercepted, decoded, and studied. The FBI was reading the enemy's mail in real time. Then, one night, Duquesne arrived with a briefcase. Inside were photographs of U.S. battleships, defense plant layouts, and experimental aircraft. He handed it over casually, like a man passing sugar across a cafe table. "It's the kind of thing," he said with a grin, "that could sink an empire." He had no idea that everything inside the case was being copied, fingerprinted, and archived before the sun even rose. By November, the ring was humming and cracking. Some agents were getting nervous. A few began asking questions about who else was involved. One courier missed a meeting and later claimed he had been followed. The pressure inside the bureau was mounting. Hoover wanted arrests. Congress was watching. Britain was pressing for action. But Appel warned against haste. "Let it play," he insisted. "Every day they talk is another thread in the web." And then came the moment Sebold had been dreading. Duquesne wanted to send someone to his apartment, not the Times Square office, his actual apartment, the place the FBI couldn't wire. Sebold panicked. If they sent the wrong man, if something slipped, it would all end in blood. He stalled, made excuses. The Bureau scrambled to install limited surveillance without detection. When the courier arrived, he only stayed 15 minutes. He handed Sebold a microfilm strip and left. Sebold sat frozen on his sofa for 2 hours afterward, unsure if he'd passed the test or been marked for death. He wasn't marked. Not yet. But something had changed. Duquesne was growing impatient. The ring was starting to feel pressure from Berlin. They wanted results, real sabotage, real disruption. And Sebold knew that meant the window was closing. He would need to hold the illusion just a little longer. The FBI would need to make its move soon. And Duquesne had one more trick left. The door clicked shut behind him with a sound that echoed louder in his chest than in the room. William Sebold stood still for a moment, listening, not for footsteps or voices, but for something deeper, something that might betray he was not alone. But the Manhattan hotel suite remained quiet. He glanced around, scanning the space. He knew it well by now, the beige walls, the modest furnishings, the heavy curtains drawn shut at all times, the corner armchair, the wooden desk with the shortwave transmitter hidden beneath it. The lamps were always left on low, not for ambiance, but for visibility. Every inch of the room was a performance stage. Because this was not just a hotel suite. It was the set of a theater whose audience would never clap, whose performers spoke in whispers and code. And every single word uttered within these walls was being recorded. This room, room 627 at the Mills Hotel on 6th Avenue, was now the beating heart of Operation Gameboard. And it was, in every sense of the word, a game, a dangerous one. Each day that passed drew the line tighter between deception and discovery, between manipulation and murder, between the illusion of control and the terror of exposure. Sebold was no longer merely pretending. He was now immersed, submerged, almost dissolved into his role. To the Nazis, he was Harry Sawyer, a newly recruited German-American willing to betray his adopted homeland. To the FBI, he was their most valuable double agent, walking the edge of a knife with every conversation, every breath. And to himself, he wasn't sure anymore. Because the moment Fritz Duquesne walked into that room, the rules changed. Duquesne had not sent word in advance. He never did. He simply appeared, unannounced, uninvited, and unmistakable. He had a talent for entrances, and this one was no different. The first meeting between Sebold and Duquesne was nothing short of electric. Duquesne burst in with his signature energy, the kind that was both magnetic and deeply unsettling. His eyes sparkled with arrogance, and his voice, though wrapped in courtesy, carried the weight of paranoia and power. "Mr. Sawyer," he said with mock formality, "it seems we are to be partners in certain endeavors." The room was wired. Every syllable Duquesne uttered was transmitted to a hidden FBI monitoring room blocks away. Agents sat in silence, headsets on, pens scratching furiously. This was the first time they'd caught Duquesne on tape in a setting he believed to be secure. It was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. And it wouldn't be the last. What followed over the next several months was a parade of traitors, each more emboldened, each more desperate, each unaware that they were delivering their confessions directly into the hands of the United States government. The operation had become a psychological labyrinth, each meeting carefully constructed to maintain the illusion, to coax just a little more, to draw the web tighter without triggering alarm. Sebold met them in hotel rooms, on ferry decks, in cafes across Manhattan and Brooklyn. They came alone or in pairs, wearing civilian clothes and nervous smiles, carrying diagrams folded in coat pockets, microdots taped behind postage stamps, letters written in invisible ink. Some were chatty, eager to prove their usefulness. Others barely spoke at all, choosing to slip him coded documents and disappear into the crowd. But no matter how they came, they all walked into the trap willingly. One man, Paul Bandler, an aircraft mechanic with access to restricted blueprints, told Sebold he could acquire the entire design layout for the Curtiss Wright P-40 Warhawk. He bragged about how easily American secrets fell into his lap. "These people," he whispered, "they don't watch, they trust." He grinned. "Fools." Another, Edward Curling, worked as a travel agent by day, but served as a courier for the Ring. He smuggled messages through neutral Latin American countries, bypassing Atlantic routes where British censors might intercept them. At one meeting, Curling produced a small roll of film that had been hidden in the false bottom of a cigarette case. Sebold took it with a nod, all while the FBI photographed the exchange through a pinhole lens hidden in the wall. Then there was Lily Stein, a glamorous and sharp-tongued socialite who doubled as a courier and recruiter. She played both sides of the ocean, charming her way into embassy dinners and elite gatherings. She gave the FBI some of its most tantalizing leads, not because she was careless, but because she trusted Harry Sawyer completely. "You know," she once told Sebold over coffee in Midtown, "the Americans think they're untouchable. They think they're safe in their skyscrapers and factories, but the Reich is already here, and they'll never see it coming." The transcripts grew longer, the files thicker, but inside the bureau, patience was thinning. There were arguments, loud, private, and sometimes deeply personal. Some agents wanted immediate arrests. The evidence was already damning. What more did they need? They feared one loose thread, one nervous spy, one sloppy mistake could unravel the entire operation. What if Duquesne vanished again? What if Sebold's cover was blown? Others, especially those close to Hoover, urged restraint. Every day Sebold stayed in the field meant more intelligence, more names, more connections. "We're not just catching a few fish," one senior agent said behind closed doors. "We're draining the entire pond." Hoover himself remained quiet. He rarely commented on the case in open meetings, preferring to read memos in silence, marking them with neat, tight handwriting in the margins. But behind the scenes, he was watching everything. He wanted the perfect headline. Not a small bust, not a quiet sweep. He wanted to unveil the biggest Nazi spy ring in American history in one explosive moment. He wanted applause, and for that, he would wait. Meanwhile, Sebold endured. He slept less. He jumped at noises. He began to lose track of his lies. At night, he stared at the ceiling of his apartment, hearing the words of the agents in his dreams, hearing Duquesne's voice on a loop. The weight of duality was crushing him. He was a patriot, but also a traitor. A liar, but also a truth-teller. A hero, but not the kind anyone would recognize on the street. He wrote letters he never sent. He walked past the FBI field office without going in. He imagined every face he passed might belong to someone sent to kill him. And then he'd return to room 627, shake hands with the enemy, and start again. There were close calls. One night, a courier named Max Blank confronted Sebold during a meeting. He'd noticed the wires tucked under the carpet. "Are you sure this place is safe?" he asked, eyes narrowed. Sebold laughed it off, blaming hotel renovations. Blank didn't press, but the tension hung in the air like gunpowder. Another time, Duquesne himself grew suspicious. He began asking strange questions, probing at Sebold's past. He started arriving unannounced, demanding updates, insisting on new meeting locations. The FBI scrambled to adjust, sometimes wiring new rooms with only hours' notice. Each time Duquesne left without incident was a small miracle. But the ring was tightening. By early 1941, the FBI had enough. They had names, occupations, transcripts, photographs, even voice recordings. The Bureau's files now filled cabinets, each drawer labeled, each folder cross-referenced. The operation had documented 23 primary agents and dozens of auxiliary contacts. They had penetrated military contractors, transportation firms, communications infrastructure, and shipping lines. It was, by every measure, the most sophisticated foreign intelligence network ever uncovered on American soil. But still, Hoover waited. He wanted more. And Sebold? He was nearing the end of his rope. He confided in his handlers that he couldn't continue much longer. "I am tired," he wrote in one report. "I feel I am being followed. If they catch me, I will not survive. Please, do something." The Bureau assured him the end was near. Just a little longer. Then, in late spring 1941, Duquesne made a request. He wanted Sebold to travel. He asked him to go to Chicago to pick up sensitive materials from a contact there. It was a test, one the FBI wasn't sure Sebold could survive, but it also gave them the final green light they needed. The net was ready, the trap was set, and next it would spring. It began not with a bang, but with silence. The kind of silence that sinks deep into the walls before something breaks loose. It was 2:17 a.m. when the first team moved. A dozen black sedans idled without headlights on a quiet Brooklyn street. Inside them, agents sat with weapons drawn, breathing in rhythm, adrenaline tight in their throats. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. This wasn't just another operation. This was the culmination of 2 years of lies, whispers, wires, and nerves worn razor thin. The Duquesne ring was about to fall, and there would be no second chances. Across New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Los Angeles, and even on the docks of San Diego, the same ballet of precision was playing out. FBI agents crept through alleys, took positions in stairwells, and waited for the signal. The operation had been drafted in absolute secrecy. Code names, unmarked memos, oral briefings only. Director Hoover had approved the final plan himself, scribbling in his tight, block-lettered script. No mistakes, no leaks, total success, or not at all. June 28, 1941. Just past 2:30 a.m. The order came down. Move, doors splintered, boots slammed into hallways. Bedroom lights flicked on to reveal astonished faces, some mid-dream, some mid-panic. In a Harlem apartment, 2 agents tackled Max Blank to the floor before he could grab the suitcase tucked under his bed. Inside were maps of East Coast naval yards and a burner code book still warm from his hand. In Brooklyn, Edward Curling was found dressed, as if expecting someone, but not the Bureau. "What is this?" he shouted, dazed, as agents dragged him to the hallway. "You're making a mistake. I work for—" He didn't finish. Lily Stein was taken while still in her dressing gown, standing in the doorway of her Park Avenue flat, stunned into silence. She asked only one question. "Harry, was he one of you?" The agents didn't answer. They didn't have to. By dawn, 23 people had been arrested, the largest coordinated domestic sweep of foreign agents in American history. But there was still one man left, the ring's architect, its phantom, the man who never truly disappeared, but always seemed to vanish, Fritz Duquesne. They came for him at 5:43 a.m. He was in his one-bedroom apartment on Riverside Drive. The knock was quiet, respectful even. Duquesne opened the door, saw the suits, the badges, the glint of metal, and without a word, slammed it shut. There was a crash from inside, then muffled yelling. When the agents forced the door open seconds later, they found him at the fireplace, trying to burn a stack of letters, notes, and photographs. His desk had been upended. The wastebasket smoked. He was panting, wild-eyed, fingers ink-stained and bleeding from a shattered glass frame. "I am sick," he gasped, grabbing his chest. "I need my doctor. I'm dying." The lead agent didn't blink. "Not today, Fritz." They cuffed him. He didn't resist. Not really. His performance collapsed the moment he realized no one was buying it. He stood still, disheveled, blinking rapidly as they read the charges aloud. Espionage, conspiracy, transmission of defense secrets to a hostile power. He turned his head slowly, scanning the room as if searching for an exit hidden in the wallpaper. But there were no exits now. Down at 26 Federal Plaza, the holding cells filled with silence and shock. Some of the accused wept, others refused to speak. One tried to bite through his own tongue. Another demanded to speak to the German consulate, but most just sat, hunched, the full weight of what had just happened crashing down on them. Many of them had no idea they had ever been watched. Not once. The deception had been perfect, and nowhere was that deception more brutal than in the mind of Fritz Duquesne. He asked for Harry Sawyer, demanded him, pleaded. "Where is Sawyer? I need to speak to him. He can explain everything." The agents exchanged glances. One leaned down and said with precise cruelty, "There is no Harry Sawyer. His name is William Sebold, and he works for us." The look on Duquesne's face, according to one of the agents who witnessed it, was not rage, not defiance. It was the stunned, bone-deep realization that he had been outplayed. Not by a soldier, not by a fellow saboteur, but by a mechanic from Newark with a recorder in his briefcase and a wire in his wall. Sebold, for his part, was already gone. Hoover had ordered him removed from New York before the arrests began. He was taken under heavy guard to a safe house upstate, then later transferred to a remote location under the protection of the Justice Department. He would not be seen in public again for decades. His final report, typed, clean, emotionless, spanned hundreds of pages and named every person he'd met, every word they'd said. It ended with one line, typed in bold, "I believe the operation is now complete." At FBI headquarters, there was no champagne, no speeches, just a sense of solemn triumph. Hoover reviewed the arrest list himself, double-checking it against the transcripts. He had done what no other domestic intelligence agency had ever pulled off: a complete penetration, identification, and neutralization of a foreign spy network operating on U.S. soil. And he had done it before America was even officially at war. The Justice Department held a press conference the next day. Reporters were stunned by the scale. 23? One asked, incredulous. All Nazis? The spokesperson nodded. Every one of them, caught in the act. Headlines the following morning screamed across the front pages. Spy Ring smashed. Nazi network in U.S. brought down by FBI. Largest arrest in espionage history. The public barely knew what to make of it. For many, it was the first time they truly understood the extent to which foreign powers had embedded themselves in American life. In factories, in shipping firms, in government buildings. The threat had not just been abstract, it had been here, breathing their air, riding their trains, sharing their sidewalks. And now, because of one man's quiet courage, it was gone. Back inside the Bureau, the postmortem had already begun. Some agents were praised, others were reassigned. Hoover had the transcripts compiled into a single internal report called Case GX. It ran over 2,000 pages and was classified top secret. Only a handful of people ever read it cover to cover. But one thing stood out on every page: the voice of a man pretending to be a traitor while serving as a patriot. The Duquesne Spy Ring was dead. Its members would soon stand trial in a federal courtroom, facing charges that could send them to prison for life. And for Hoover, it was the moment he had always dreamed of. Not just a win, but the win. He had built the Bureau for this moment, and now no one, Congress, the President, not even the Army, could ignore what the FBI had become. But in the cells of Manhattan, the accused were waking up to a new reality. There would be no rescue mission, no swap, no last-minute orders from Berlin. They were alone. And in the end, that was the final betrayal. The country they tried to serve never came for them. The courtroom smelled of stale cigars, mildew, and secrets too long buried. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse in Manhattan creaked open on the morning of September 3, 1941, revealing a world that had long been invisible to the American public. A world of whispering agents, forged identities, double lives, and cold betrayals. 33 men and women, accused of the most serious espionage charges in U.S. history, sat behind the defendant's bench under armed guard, their expressions flickering between defiance and dread. At the center of it all was Fritz Duquesne, part showman, part madman, still clutching the tattered remnants of his own mythology, even as the walls finally closed in. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy had already begun. Reporters huddled under umbrellas in a late summer drizzle, scrawling into notebooks, elbowing each other for quotes, and scanning the street for any glimpse of the infamous spies. Headlines had started appearing even before the arraignments were finalized. Nazi spy ring smashed. Biggest espionage trial in American history. Hitler's agents in our midst. J. Edgar Hoover, never one to waste an opportunity for myth-making, had already ordered the FBI's press office to distribute sanitized photos and quotes to trusted journalists, crafting a carefully managed image of the Bureau as tireless defenders of the Republic. But inside the Bureau, the mood was not triumphant. It was fractured. Hoover's deputies in New York were furious over leaks they hadn't authorized. Assistant Director Percy Deke DeLoach wanted tighter press controls, while others worried the narrative was slipping away. Privately, some agents feared the Bureau's biggest counterintelligence victory could unravel in the courtroom, if even one misstep or technicality could be found. Behind closed doors, memos flew between Hoover's office and the U.S. Attorney's staff. Everything had to be flawless. The evidence, the witnesses, the timing. Hoover did not tolerate defeat, especially not in public. And then there was the matter of William Sebold. The man whose quiet courage had brought the entire Duquesne ring to its knees was now being prepped as the prosecution's star witness. For weeks, he had remained under guard in a safe house just outside the city, flanked by 2 plainclothes agents wherever he went, even in his sleep. He had lost weight. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes shadowed by months of paranoia and guilt. The FBI psychologists who occasionally checked on him knew he was unraveling, but there was no turning back. His testimony wasn't just necessary, it was the spine of the entire case. When the trial began in earnest, it did so behind closed doors. National security, the judge had declared, no public gallery, no press inside, just the accused, their attorneys, the prosecution, a handful of FBI personnel, and the stenographers. But that didn't stop the trial from spilling into the public imagination. Day after day, newspapers speculated about the proceedings, publishing leaks and rumors with feverish intensity. Some tabloids suggested a Nazi plot to assassinate Sebold before he could testify. Others hinted that Duquesne had secret information so damaging that Berlin was negotiating a back-channel deal to extradite him. None of it was true, but in the absence of facts, myth rushed in to fill the vacuum. Inside the courtroom, the reality was more chilling than any headline. When Sebold finally took the stand, there was no theatrical pause, no moment of cinematic tension. He simply stepped forward, placed his hand on the Bible, and took the oath. The room held its breath. He wore a dark suit. His voice was quiet, methodical, almost painfully restrained. But as he spoke, the sheer weight of what he had endured began to crush the silence. He detailed how the Abwehr had approached him in Hamburg, how they had threatened his family, how he had flown to New York under orders from Berlin, and how, instead of surrendering to fear, he had walked into the U.S. consulate and asked to see someone from American intelligence. The FBI attorneys, working closely with federal prosecutors, laid out the evidence in devastating precision. Photographs of secret meetings, microphones embedded in walls, audio recordings, dozens of them. In the courtroom, as each tape was played, The effect was electric. Jurors and defendants alike sat frozen as their own voices echoed through the room, captured in real time as they discussed bombing schedules, ship movements, and names of American engineers working on classified military projects. One defense attorney, a sharp-eyed ex-military man named Robert B. Lowe, attempted to discredit the tapes, arguing that they had been obtained without proper warrants. He challenged the legality of the FBI's surveillance tactics and claimed that Sebold was a government pawn, manipulated into entrapment. But it was a weak play. The judge, stern, methodical, and deeply patriotic, had already ruled the recordings admissible. And with each passing day, Sebold's testimony only grew stronger. He wasn't a spy, he insisted. He was a citizen. A man who had been caught in a trap, but who had chosen his country over fear. Fritz Duquesne, meanwhile, put on a show of his own. He scoffed at the charges. He mocked the FBI. "I am not a traitor," he shouted during one hearing. "I am a soldier. I have always fought for freedom." His attorney, a bombastic trial lawyer named Solomon Weinstock, tried to paint Duquesne as a victim of persecution, a misunderstood patriot targeted for his political views. He made repeated attempts to delay the trial, citing Duquesne's failing health, his need for additional medical evaluations, and what he called psychological torture by the Bureau. But the judge wasn't buying it. The courtroom was not a stage for performance. It was a crucible, and Duquesne was burning. As the weeks dragged on, the trial grew heavier. One by one, members of the spy ring were called to testify, but most remained silent. Some wept, a few begged for mercy, others sat stone-faced, refusing to acknowledge the proceedings at all. The FBI's legal team presented blueprints recovered from apartments, intercepted coded messages, forged passports, and detailed witness interviews. It was a mountain of evidence, overwhelming in its volume and damning in its clarity. But even inside the Bureau, not everyone was celebrating. Some agents grumbled that Hoover's obsession with publicity was compromising the long-term goals of American counterintelligence. Once these spies were convicted, some warned, their networks in Europe and Latin America might go dark, costing the Allies valuable insights. There were whispers that Hoover had rushed the arrests for headlines, not strategy. But in the shadow of war, such dissent rarely reached the surface. When the final verdicts came down in January 1942, they struck like thunder. Duquesne was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Others received 8, 10, 16, even 17 years. It was the largest mass conviction of foreign agents in U.S. history. Outside the courthouse, the headlines were ready. SBI ring crushed. America strikes back. Hoover's men deliver justice. But inside the FBI's New York office, the mood was more complicated. Some agents toasted. Others sat silently at their desks. They knew what the newspapers did not. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Because across the ocean, Hitler's war machine was still grinding forward. Pearl Harbor was just weeks away, and the spy war, now fully awake, would only grow darker from here. Sebold never returned to a normal life. His identity had been exposed. The Bureau relocated him to a small town under a new name, but he remained paranoid, isolated, and increasingly depressed. The weight of what he had done, of how deeply he had buried himself into a world of lies and betrayal, never lifted. His testimony had helped destroy a network, but it had also destroyed his peace. As for Duquesne, he faded into prison obscurity. He remained defiant until the end, telling anyone who would listen that he had been betrayed, misunderstood, wrongfully imprisoned. But history would not remember him kindly. The myth had shattered, the ring had been broken, justice had been served, but America had only months left before the war would truly reach its shores. It began not with celebration, but with silence. Not with parades, not with headlines trumpeting national triumph, but with a shifting of eyes and a tightening of mouths, as though the country had witnessed something too revealing, too close to the bone. The Duquesne Spy Ring trial, the largest espionage case in American history, had concluded. 33 spies, every last one of them, convicted. An intelligence operation of unprecedented scope and daring had unfolded in full view of the government, the press, and the people, and then, almost as quickly, it was buried. In another time, the verdicts might have been mythologized, turned into patriotic legend. But in the final weeks of January 1942, the country had no attention left to spare for the ghosts of enemy agents. Pearl Harbor had been attacked less than 2 months earlier. The United States was now at war. Headlines had moved on, and so had the nation's emotional focus. Fear had a new face, and it no longer resembled Fritz Duquesne or the spectral shadows of German couriers in Manhattan cafes. It looked like Japanese bombers, sunken ships at Pearl, and a Pacific horizon alive with fire. Inside FBI headquarters, the mood was strangely muted. J. Edgar Hoover had gotten the headlines he craved. Greatest spy roundup in American history, screamed the wire services. But now, he turned toward wartime crisis management with the same controlled paranoia that had animated him since the 1920s. He gave no medals to the men who had orchestrated the sting. No public thanks to William Sebold. He had already reaped the rewards of their labor and now needed to turn the Bureau toward more immediate dangers. Internally, a new counterintelligence apparatus was born almost overnight. What had once been a loose operation, nested under general investigations, was carved out and given its own authority, the Counterintelligence Division. Sebold, the man who had played a triple role as traitor, actor, and savior, slipped out of the spotlight and into the long shadows of history. He had walked into the jaws of the German war machine and turned it inside out. But when the curtain fell, there was no encore. The Bureau erased him from view. He was quietly relocated, issued a new identity, and placed under permanent federal protection. His nerves were shattered. His health declined. By the mid-1950s, he was living under an assumed name in California, working odd jobs, consumed by ulcers and paranoia, unsure if any of the men he'd once betrayed would re-emerge with vengeance in their hearts. There would be no book deals, no interviews, no tributes. Just the quiet erosion of a man who had once held the fate of a nation's secrets in his trembling hands. Duquesne, meanwhile, died as he had lived, in performance. In prison, he refused all attempts at cooperation. He claimed the charges against him were fraudulent, the product of Anglo-American hysteria and lies. He called himself a political prisoner, a patriot misunderstood by a naive and cowardly public. In truth, the legend of Fritz Duquesne was already splintering under the weight of his contradictions. Even the Nazis had begun to distrust him in his final months of freedom, suspecting that he was either overplaying his hand or hiding deeper allegiances. But in his cell, he remained unrepentant. He died in 1956 in the prison hospital ward at Leavenworth, bitter, blind, and alone, but still boasting to guards that the world would one day remember his name. It didn't. The ring he built had been methodically destroyed, its members scattered across federal prisons from Atlanta to New York. Some died behind bars, others were deported. A few re-entered society years later, their allegiances permanently severed, their histories blurred under the dust of war. No commemorative plaques were installed, no historical markers were placed. The story of the Duquesne Spy Ring, for all its cinematic espionage and psychological drama, was effectively forgotten. But the institutions it shaped endured. The FBI, newly empowered by its role in wartime counterintelligence, began to formalize relationships with the military and with British intelligence. Lessons learned from the Sebold operation became protocols. Deception, wire surveillance, undercover infiltration, all once controversial, were now cornerstones of national defense. In 1947, when the Central Intelligence Agency was born from the ruins of the OSS, its architects were well aware of the case that had proven America's vulnerability. The Duquesne Ring wasn't just a story, it was a blueprint. And still, the story returned in quiet echoes in later years when America was again forced to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that its enemies did not always wear uniforms. In 2010, a woman named Anna Chapman became the face of a new espionage scandal, this time not German, but Russian. She and 9 other Russian sleeper agents had lived for years inside the U.S., some under deep cover, others as open members of the American community. Like Duquesne's operatives, they used encrypted communications, secret handoffs, and social engineering to collect intelligence on defense contractors and government officials. Once again, the public was stunned. Once again, the question arose, how long had they been here, and how much had they learned? This was not a question limited to the Cold War or its aftermath. Chinese industrial espionage grew into one of the defining national security challenges of the 21st century. In courtrooms across America, federal agents now prosecute cases of cyber intrusion, intellectual property theft, and clandestine academic collaborations aimed at siphoning defense technologies and biotechnical innovations. The battleground no longer centers on hotel rooms and ferry terminals. It unfolds across server farms, private labs, and encrypted messaging platforms. And yet, the essence remains unchanged. Human weakness exploited, secrets stolen, nations deceived. Each time such a story emerges, its contours echo that forgotten trial in 1941. The long hours of testimony, the decoded transmissions, the ordinary people caught in the machinery of war. Each new spy unmasked whispers a ghostly reminder, this has happened before. It will happen again. The press, ever fickle, continues its cycle of astonishment and amnesia. Reporters cover these cases in dramatic bursts. Russian operatives, Chinese hackers, rogue insiders with USB sticks in federal labs, and then move on. But inside intelligence agencies, the memory of the Duquesne ring lingers like a foundational trauma. The case remains required reading at FBI Quantico and at CIA training camps, not because it was the most sophisticated operation, but because it was the moment the United States learned, with absolute certainty, that its enemies had already arrived, and that some of them looked like neighbors, colleagues, or friends. The burden of secrecy is not easily shed. Even now, redacted files from the case remain buried in archives, some names still obscured by ink. Why? Perhaps because the real danger was never just foreign operatives, but what their presence revealed about America's own blind spots. For years, these spies moved freely, helped not by their skills, but by the nation's disbelief that such things could happen on its soil. That disbelief cost time. It almost cost more. And in the end, it cost William Sebold everything. The man who had held open the door for truth, who had lived 2 lives until they nearly killed him, faded into obscurity without even a grave marked in his real name. No medals, no statues, just silence. But sometimes silence carries memory more deeply than words. The Duquesne Spy Ring proved that America was never untouchable. Not in 1941, not today, and not tomorrow. The world has only grown smaller. The tools have grown faster. The masks have become digital, the betrayals more elegant. But the war, quiet, invisible, relentless, continues, and the battlefield has only changed shape. They faded, one by one, like ghosts retreating into fog. William Sebold, the man who walked between 2 worlds, disappeared into the shadows with no parade, no medals, and no memoir. He lived out the rest of his days under a false name, in a modest home in California, unable to hold steady work, constantly battling anxiety, depression, and the haunting knowledge that at any moment someone might find him and call him traitor. The man who saved a nation from itself was forgotten by the very country he had risked everything to protect. No books bore his name, no honors lined his walls. He died in 1970, quietly, anonymously, buried under his alias, as though his entire life had been a mistake the world was too embarrassed to remember. Fritz Duquesne, the man of 1,000 lies, died as he lived, wrapped in the myth of his own creation. Convicted in the largest espionage case in U.S. history, he spent over a decade in federal prison, unrepentant to the end. Even in his final days, his letters to friends and editors claimed he was framed, misunderstood, a loyal soldier of empire, not a traitor. He died in 1956, blind and broken, in a government hospital for the indigent. His body dumped in an unmarked grave, no family, no eulogy, no flag. The others scattered across the decades. Some served their time and slipped back into civilian life, like actors who had been caught reading from the wrong script. A few tried to rebuild, others never quite managed. One hanged himself before sentencing, another died in a car crash while awaiting appeal. The war swallowed the headlines, and with it, the memory of what had been the greatest spy catch in American history, a story too incredible to be fiction and too fragile to survive the coming storm. Because just 6 months after the verdicts were read, the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. And overnight, America's view of espionage transformed from a courtroom curiosity to a matter of life and death. Japanese internment, foreign surveillance, enemy aliens, the country's appetite for subtle spy games vanished. There was no time for whispers anymore. Now, the nation only listened for sirens. Within the halls of the FBI, the Duquesne Ring became both legend and leverage. Hoover made sure of it. The case became a trophy, a justification for expanding wiretap authority, undercover operations, and domestic intelligence capabilities. The seeds sown in those Manhattan hotel rooms, those bugged offices and forged letters, grew into the towering bureaucracy of modern American intelligence. Years later, when the CIA would be born in the ashes of wartime espionage, the lessons learned from the Duquesne affair, the patient surveillance, the human factor, the war of nerves, would live on, quietly encoded into the DNA of a new kind of warfare. But time does strange things to memory. The Duquesne case became a footnote. History books barely mentioned it. Students never heard the names Sebold or Duquesne. It didn't fit the Hollywood version of espionage. No glamorous agents, no rooftop chases, no dramatic shootouts. Just men in gray suits in rooms without windows, listening to reels of magnetic tape. And yet, those tapes, scratchy, muffled, and damning, had saved lives. They had exposed 33 active Nazi agents embedded in America's factories, ports, and military installations. Had even one of them gone undetected, the story might have ended in sabotage, in explosions, in blood. Instead, it ended in silence. But silence doesn't mean safety, because in the decades that followed, the pattern repeated. New enemies, new methods, same old story. In 2010, America watched in eerie déjà vu as a ring of Russian sleeper agents was uncovered in suburban New Jersey and New York. They too had lived among neighbors, worked day jobs, raised children. They too had sent coded messages. They too believed they were invisible. And once again, the revelation sent shockwaves through the public, a reminder that espionage doesn't vanish with the end of a war. It merely puts on a new coat. Today, the spies wear suits and conference badges. They work in aerospace labs and data centers. They don't pass microfilm in dark alleys. They click upload in seconds. Some don't even know they're working for a foreign adversary. They're recruited through business partnerships, friendly research grants, innocuous job offers. Sometimes, it's not even a person who spies. It's code. Yet, through all of it, through the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the rise of China, the spread of cyber espionage, the story of the Duquesne Ring lingers, like a half-remembered dream buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and war. Because that case wasn't just about 33 men and women who chose the wrong side, it was about a country waking up to the fact that its enemies weren't always across the ocean. Sometimes they were across the hallway. It was about what it costs to keep a democracy safe, not in bombs or tanks, but in trust, in paranoia, in the quiet erosion of certainty. And above all, it was about the invisible war that never ends, fought not with bullets, but with secrets. William Sebold once said in one of his last recorded interviews, "I was a mechanic. I fixed engines. I didn't know how to fix people." And maybe he was right. Maybe no one could fix what was broken. Not in Duquesne, not in the FBI, not in the machine of war that kept grinding forward, powered by fear and ambition. But for a brief moment in history, a man with no training, no fame, and no weapon but a reel of tape held the line. He didn't ask for glory, he only asked to be believed. And that, in the cold, brittle world of espionage, may be the rarest victory of all.